A devoted father stands on his front porch, pleading with news cameras for the safe return of his pregnant wife and two young daughters who vanished without a trace. But as investigators look past his calm exterior, they discover a chilling digital trail of a secret affair and a cold-blooded transformation that turns a hero dad into one of the most hated monsters in American history. Hello everyone, welcome to the Unsettling Lullaby. I'm your guide into the darkest corners of the world where shadows whisper and silence screams. Are you prepared to embrace the dark? If you're drawn to the world of true crime and unsolved mysteries, join our circle. Subscribe and enable all notifications. I am with you, and our lullaby starts right now. Part 1: The Perfect Picture. The Curated Life. In the digital glow of a smartphone screen, life in Frederick, Colorado was flawless. Shannon Watts, a 34-year-old mother of two, was the architect and star of this reality. Her social media presence, primarily on Facebook, was a vibrant, meticulously composed mosaic of domestic bliss. To her thousands of friends and followers, she was a whirlwind of positive affirmations, entrepreneurial hustle, and devoted motherhood. She was Shannon Watts, Boss Babe, a top promoter for the nutritional supplement company Lavelle, and her feed was its own infomercial for a perfected existence. There were the sun-drenched photos of her daughters, 4-year-old Bella, thoughtful and wide-eyed, and 3-year-old Celeste, or CC, a bubbly tornado of curls and mischief. They were captured in matching outfits, splashing in inflatable pools in the backyard of their 2-story, taupe-colored house on Saratoga Trail, or sitting patiently as Shannon lovingly styled their hair. There were images of healthy, artfully arranged Thrive shakes, the product she credited with transforming her life, alongside testimonials of increased energy and weight loss. She posted videos from her Thrive car, a white Lexus SUV she'd earned, talking to the camera with the fervent, polished enthusiasm of a daytime TV host. "Rise and grind," she'd cheer, her North Carolina accent softened but present, a cup of her signature protein coffee in hand. Her husband, Chris Watts, was a supporting character in this narrative. He appeared in photos and videos, a handsome, lean man with a quiet smile, often looking slightly off camera, as if unsure of his mark. In her posts, he was my rock, my best friend, the hardworking provider who worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum. She celebrated their date nights, their family trips to the North Carolina beaches to visit her family, and their recent joyous announcement. She was 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they planned to name Nico. The gender reveal, a cloud of blue confetti, had been a social media event. The caption read, "Our family is complete." The house itself was a character in this story. It was new, a symbol of their burgeoning success. The decor was a study in modern farmhouse chic. Clean lines, distressed wood signs with uplifting mantras like "Bless this mess," plush gray sofas, and shelves lined with perfectly aligned decorative spheres and framed family photos. Every surface in the posted images was clear, every pillow plumped. It was a home that spoke of control, of a vision realized. Shannon's life was a product she was selling, and the metrics, likes, comments, emoji reaction, were the validation of its quality. But like any carefully staged production, the strain of maintaining the illusion was invisible to the audience. Behind the filters, financial pressures mounted. The house, the cars, the furniture were underwritten by a precarious lattice of debt. Chris's salary was substantial, but Shannon's Thrive income was volatile, and their spending consistently outpaced their earnings. They were facing foreclosure on their previous home in North Carolina. The pregnancy, while celebrated publicly, had come at a time of private tension. Friends and family knew of recent marital struggles. Shannon had spent the previous 6 weeks in North Carolina with the girls, a trip extended partly to give her and Chris space after she discovered a suspicious restaurant charge on their credit card bill, a charge for two, when he should have been alone. She had returned to Colorado just 2 days ago on a late flight August 11th, hopping for a fresh start. The day before she vanished, August 12th, was a typical busy Sunday captured in her posts, a friend's birthday party for the children, family time. She sent a final, telling text to a friend that evening. "He's not being nice. I feel like I'm not wanted." The curtain was fraying, but from the outside the show remained impeccably bright. Aye, the unanswered door. The morning of Monday, August 13, 2018, dawned clear and bright over the Colorado plains. In the Watts home on Saratoga Trail, all was still. At 1:48 p.m., Shannon's friend, Nicole Atkinson, pulled up to the house. They had a 9:00 a.m. appointment to see a doctor together, a playdate for their children afterward. Shannon had never shown up, never called. This was profoundly out of character. Shannon was relentlessly punctual, her life governed by the alerts on her phone and a shared family calendar. Nicole had been calling and texting for hours, her messages progressing from curious, "Hey, we at the dock," to concerned, "Shannon, are you okay?" to deeply worried, "Please call me. I'm getting scared." Now standing on the front porch under the harsh midday sun, Nicole felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The house was silent. The garage door was closed. Through the front windows she could see nothing amiss, just the orderly, empty living room. She rang the doorbell. Its chime echoed inside, unanswered. She knocked firmly, the sound stark against the quiet of the cul-de-sac. Nothing. She called Chris Watts. He answered, his voice flat, devoid of urgency. Nicole, her own voice tight with anxiety, explained she was at the house, that Shannon had missed their appointment, that she wasn't answering. "That's weird," Chris said, the statement hanging in the air, empty of emotion. He said he was at work, about 40 minutes away at the Anadarko oil field site. He mentioned Shannon might have gone to a friend's house. He offered to call a neighbor to let Nicole inside. But Nicole's alarm was now a screaming siren. She called 911 at 1:40 p.m. "I have a friend who's supposed to be at a doctor's appointment," she told the dispatcher, her words tumbling out. "She's not answering her phone, her car, here. Her husband's at work. The kids are supposed to be here. Something's wrong." While on the phone, she and another friend who had arrived, Addie Lynn, began peering through windows. The interior was pristine, unsettlingly so. In the living room, Shannon's purse sat on the couch. Her phone, its screen dark, was on the kitchen counter next to her car keys. A pair of the children's shoes were neatly placed by the stairs. It was a diorama of interrupted life. A snapshot taken the moment before everyone simply evaporated. Aye, the welfare check. Officer Scott Coonrod of the Frederick Police Department was the first to arrive at 1:49 p.m. He found Nicole and Addie on the porch, their faces etched with fear. The scene was immediately flagged as unusual. This wasn't a report of a loud party or a suspicious person. It was a report of an absence, a negative space where a vibrant family should have been. Coonrod noted the details: the white Lexus in the closed garage, the personal effects inside, the profound quiet. He, too, found no response to his knocks and doorbell rings. He called Chris Watts. Chris's demeanor, as described by Coonrod, was the first major dissonant note. He was calm, almost detached. He confirmed his wife and daughters were supposed to be home. He reiterated they might have gone to a friend's house. He gave permission for the officer to enter, directing him to a hidden key in the garage. There was no panic in his voice, no frantic questions, no immediate urge to rush home. His primary concern, oddly, seemed to be whether he needed to leave work. Coonrod told him he should come home. With Chris's permission, Coonrod entered the house. The air inside was still and cool, the silence absolute and heavy. The cleanliness was striking, almost aggressive in its normalcy. He moved through the rooms, calling out, "Frederick, police, anyone home?" His voice was absorbed by the plush carpet and upholstery. He found Shannon's phone, purse, and keys exactly as described. In the master bedroom, the bed was made. The children's rooms were tidy, toys put away. He opened closet doors, checked bathrooms. Nothing was out of place, and no one was there. The absence of the children's car seats was a critical detail. Shannon's SUV was in the garage. If she had taken the girls somewhere, how? A friend might have picked them up, but it made no sense she would leave her phone, purse, and keys behind. It was as if she had stepped out for a moment, intending to return immediately, and vanished into the ether. IV, the husband's return. Chris Watts arrived home around 2:40 p.m. Officers noted his vehicle pulling into the driveway not with screeching tires, but with a calm, normal turn. He exited his work truck, a white Ford F-150, and walked toward the officers and the small cluster of concerned friends now gathered outside. He was dressed in a neon green safety shirt and jeans, his face a mask of placid confusion. His physical presence was as unsettling as his phone demeanor. He did not look like a man whose pregnant wife and 2 young daughters were missing. There was no pallor of shock, no trembling hands, no tears welling in his eyes. He moved with a casual, almost sluggish gait. He hugged Nickel briefly, a stiff, perfunctory gesture. When asked questions, his answers were short, delivered in a soft, monotone voice. He told officers he had last seen Shannon at about 5:15 a.m. when he left for work. He claimed she was in bed, that they had spoken about her doctor's appointment later that day. He said the girls were asleep in their rooms. He offered that they had had an emotional conversation the night before but provided no details, shutting down that line of inquiry with a wall of bland vagueness. Officers took him inside to walk through the house. Chris moved through the familiar rooms like a ghost in his own home. He pointed out nothing unusual. He confirmed Shannon's purse and phone were where they should be. He showed them the girls' rooms, empty and neat. His affect was so flat, so devoid of appropriate emotion, that it raised more red flags than any outburst of panic would have. It was a performance of concern, but one delivered by an actor who hadn't bothered to learn his lines. He consented to a search of the house. As officers began a more thorough inspection, Chris sat on the front porch steps with Nickel and Addie. He scrolled absently on his phone. He made small talk. At one point, he speculated aloud that maybe Shannon had taken the girls to the nearby pool. It was a weak theory, immediately dismantled by the facts on the ground, the abandoned essentials, the missed appointment. Meanwhile, inside, the eerie silence deepened. Investigators opened drawers and cabinets, not yet searching for evidence of a crime, but for clues to a disappearance. They found meticulously organized closets, a refrigerator stocked with healthy food and pre-made shakes, a laundry room with folded clothes. In the basement, they saw Chris's workout equipment. Everything spoke of order, routine, control. The only thing out of order was the complete absence of the family that lived there. The shoes by the stairs seemed to accuse the quiet. The keys on the counter were a promise of a return that felt increasingly impossible. The phone, a device that was an extension of Shannon Watts's very being, sat dark and silent. The perfect picture on social media had been replaced by a far more haunting image. A beautiful, empty house, a husband whose calm was chilling, and a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the bright Colorado day whole. The search was no longer just for a missing woman and her children. It was for a crack in the perfect facade, a reason for the silence, a truth that was already beginning to curdle in the summer heat. The investigation and the unraveling of the story behind the perfect life had just begun. Welcome back to the unsettling lullaby. In Chapter 1, we met Dr. H. Holmes, the charming gentleman of Inglewood, but who was he really? Today, we peel back the mask and discover the monster beneath. I am with you, and Chapter 2 begins now. Before he was H. Holmes, he was Herman Webster Mudgett, born on May 16, 1861, in the small town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. The white wooden houses, the church steeple rising against the mountains, the close-knit community, it all seemed peaceful enough. But even as a child, Herman was different. His classmates remembered him as intelligent but cold. There was something missing behind his eyes, something essential that connected other children to feelings of empathy and remorse. When neighborhood pets went missing, Herman was often nearby. When smaller children got hurt in accidents that seemed just a bit too convenient, Herman watched with fascination rather than concern. The defining moment of his childhood came when he was around 11 years old. A group of older boys, knowing Herman's fear of the local doctor's office, dragged him inside and forced him to touch a human skeleton used for medical study. They expected screams. They expected tears. Instead, Herman's fear transformed into something else entirely: fascination, obsession. From that moment forward, death became his subject of study. His parents were strict, religious, Presbyterian. His father used physical discipline liberally. His mother was cold and distant. Herman learned early that showing emotion was weakness, that manipulation was survival, that the world belonged to those clever enough to take what they wanted. He excelled in school despite his disturbing tendencies. He was handsome, articulate, and knew how to present himself as respectable. In 1878, at age 17, he married Clara Lovering. She was his first victim, not of murder, but of abandonment. He would remain legally married to her for the rest of his life while marrying at least 2 other women and conducting countless affairs. In 1882, Herman enrolled at the University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor. This is where his true education began, not in medicine, but in murder. The medical school had access to cadavers for dissection and study. Herman quickly realized these bodies could be exploited. His first scheme was simple but effective. Steal a cadaver, disfigure it beyond recognition, plant it somewhere as if it were an accidental death, then claim life insurance for a fictional person who matched the body's general description. It worked, and it worked again, and again. Herman was making more money from insurance fraud than most doctors made from legitimate practice. But more importantly, he was learning how bodies decomposed, learning which acids dissolved flesh fastest, learning how to dismember efficiently, learning how bones could be articulated and sold to medical schools for teaching purposes. He was turning death into a business, and he was good at it. By the time he graduated in 1884, Herman Webster Mudgett had become someone else entirely. He had learned that identity was fluid, that names could be changed, that paper trails could be manufactured or erased. He had learned that people believed what they wanted to believe, that a well-dressed man with a medical degree and a charming smile could get away with almost anything. He drifted through several towns, leaving behind debts and suspicious deaths. He worked briefly in New York, then Philadelphia. Each time he moved before anyone could connect the dots. Each time he refined his methods. Each time he became more confident in his ability to manipulate, exploit, and kill without consequence. In 1886, he arrived in Chicago and chose a new name, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. The initials HH gave him an air of sophistication. Holmes sounded respectable, trustworthy, Anglo-Saxon. Dr. H. Holmes, a man you could trust with your life. He found work at a pharmacy owned by Dr. E.S. Holton at the corner of 63rd and Wallace in the Inglewood neighborhood. Dr. Holton was elderly and ill with cancer. His wife Elizabeth ran the day-to-day operations. When Dr. Holton died, Holmes saw an opportunity. He turned on the charm with the grieving widow. He offered to buy the pharmacy, generous terms, easy payments. She could even continue living upstairs. Elizabeth Holton agreed. Holmes took over the pharmacy, and within months Elizabeth Holton disappeared. When neighbors asked about her, Holmes had a ready explanation. She had moved to California to live with relatives. No one questioned it. No one investigated. Holmes now owned the entire building, and he had eliminated the only person who could challenge his claim. This was the pattern that would define him. Identify a target, gain their trust, isolate them from family and friends, exploit them financially, then eliminate them when they were no longer useful. Every relationship was transactional. Every person was a resource to be consumed. In 1887, Holmes married Meada Belknap. He was still legally married to Clara Lovering, but that didn't matter. Meada was middle class, respectable, and came with social connections. She gave him legitimacy. She gave him the appearance of being a stable family man. She had no idea what her husband truly was. That same year, Holmes began construction on the building that would become known as the Murder Castle. He hired and fired construction crews constantly, ensuring no single contractor understood the full blueprint. Each crew built a section without understanding how it connected to the whole. The design was his alone. To his neighbors, Holmes was building a mixed-use commercial and residential property, perfectly normal for a growing neighborhood. The ground floor would have shops generating rental income. The upper floors would have apartments and his personal offices. Sound business sense. No one suspected that the building was actually a machine designed for one purpose: killing people in secret and disposing of their bodies without a trace. Holmes was methodical, patient, and utterly without conscience. He wasn't killing in fits of rage or passion. He was building infrastructure. He was preparing for mass murder the way another businessman might prepare for manufacturing. The psychology behind this level of premeditation is almost impossible to comprehend. This wasn't a man who lost control. This was a man in complete control, who had decided that other human beings were simply raw materials for profit. By 1888, the building was complete. Holmes had his pharmacy, his rental income, his respectable facade, and he had his killing floor waiting for victims. Herman Webster Mudgett had fully transformed into Dr. H. Holmes. The mask was perfect. The monster was ready. And Chicago, with its millions of visitors arriving for the World's Fair, was about to provide him with an endless supply of victims. In Chapter 3, we enter the murder castle itself and discover the horrifying blueprint Holmes created for systematic murder. The shadows deepen. Subscribe to the unsettling lullaby. I am with you. Welcome back to the unsettling lullaby. We've met the monster. Now we enter his lair. Today we walk through the murder castle room by room, discovering the architecture of evil. This is Chapter 3. The shadows are waiting. From the outside, the building at 63rd and Wallace looked unremarkable. 3 stories of red brick, large windows on the ground floor displaying pharmacy goods and jewelry. Customers came and went daily, purchasing medicine, having prescriptions filled, browsing watches and rings. The ground floor was completely legitimate. Homes needed the rental income and the respectable cover. But the second floor was where the nightmare began. The staircase from the ground floor led up to a hallway that made no logical sense. It twisted and turned at odd angles. Doors lined both sides, but they didn't follow any standard floor plan. Some doors opened to rooms, some opened to brick walls, some opened to sheer drops where a floor should have been. Walking through the second floor of Holmes's building was like walking through a maze designed by someone who wanted you to get lost and never find your way out. Holmes had over 30 rooms on the second floor alone, but many of them were barely large enough to fit a bed. They were cells, not bedrooms, and each one had been modified with features that revealed their true purpose. Several rooms had gas lines installed that fed directly into the living space. The controls for these gas lines were not in the rooms themselves, but in Holmes's private office down the hall. A woman renting one of these rooms would go to sleep thinking she was safe, not knowing that Holmes could turn a valve and silently fill her room with asphyxiating gas while she slept. The rooms were soundproofed. Even if someone woke and tried to scream, no one would hear. Other rooms had been constructed as airtight vaults with double-thick walls and iron doors. Holmes would rent these to women under the pretense that they were secure spaces to store valuables. Once a victim was inside and the door was sealed, Holmes could slowly reduce the oxygen supply, watching through a hidden peephole as his victim suffocated over the course of hours. This wasn't quick killing. This was torture. This was watching someone die slowly while they clawed at walls and begged for air. Every room had a peephole. Holmes had designed the building so he could watch his victims at all times, sleeping, waking, dressing, dying. The power and control this gave him was intoxicating. He was God in his castle, determining who lived and who died, watching it all unfold. The doors throughout the second floor had another disturbing feature. Many could only be locked from the outside. A woman entering her room might not notice until she tried to leave and discovered she was trapped. By then, Holmes would be at the gas valve or the oxygen control, beginning the killing process. But perhaps the most chilling features were the trapdoors and chutes. Several rooms had sections of floor that could be released via a lever in Holmes's office. A victim would be standing in what appeared to be a normal room, and suddenly the floor would drop away, sending them plummeting down a greased chute into the basement. The fall wouldn't kill them. Holmes wanted them alive when they reached the bottom. The real horror was still to come. The third floor was simpler, Holmes's personal apartments and office space. This is where he conducted his legitimate business dealings, met with associates, and maintained his double life. This is where he slept at night, comfortable and undisturbed by the suffering happening one floor below. But the basement was hell itself. The chutes from the second floor deposited victims directly onto a large table in the center of the basement. It was not a normal table. It was a dissection table, custom built, with leather restraints at multiple points and drainage channels cut into its surface. Surgical instruments hung on the walls, saws, scalpels, bone cutters. These were not the tools of a doctor trying to heal. These were the tools of someone who enjoyed taking bodies apart piece by piece. Next to the dissection table stood several large vats filled with acid. These were industrial-strength corrosive chemicals capable of dissolving flesh and soft tissue within hours. Holmes would dismember bodies on his table, then drop the pieces into the acid. Bones took longer, so he had another solution for those. Against one wall stood an enormous furnace, custom-built to reach extraordinarily high temperatures. It was far too large for heating a building this size. The contractors who installed it remembered Holmes's explanation. He was planning to start a glass-bending business and needed a kiln, but Holmes never bent any glass. The furnace was for burning bones, specifically human bones. At high enough temperatures, even skeletal remains could be reduced to ash and fragments that could be scattered or dumped without anyone recognizing what they were. For bones he wanted to preserve, Holmes had another method. He had taught himself articulation, the process of cleaning bones and assembling complete skeletons that could be sold to medical schools. A well-articulated human skeleton could fetch $200, sometimes more. Holmes was literally selling his victims' remains for profit. He would kill a woman, dissolve her flesh in acid, articulate her bones into a teaching skeleton, and ship it to a medical school under the guise of being a legitimate supplier of anatomical specimens. The basement also contained lime pits for rapid decomposition and a medieval-looking rack that could stretch a body. The rack served two purposes. It could be used for torture, and it could stretch a skeleton to make it appear to come from a taller individual, increasing its value to buyers. Scattered throughout the basement, investigators would later find personal effects: jewelry, clothing, shoes, letters, photographs. These were the remnants of people who had come to Chicago with dreams and ambitions and had instead found their way into Holmes's basement, never to leave. The genius of Holmes's design was that it was hidden in plain sight. The building stood in a busy neighborhood. People walked past it every day. Children played in front of it. Customers shopped in the ground floor pharmacy. And no one suspected that the building itself was a murder weapon. Every room, every door, every chute and valve designed specifically to facilitate killing. Holmes had created something unprecedented in criminal history, a building engineered from the ground up for systematic murder. This wasn't a crime scene. This was a factory. Holmes wasn't killing in moments of passion or rage. He was manufacturing death with industrial efficiency. The psychology required to conceive, design, and construct such a place is almost beyond comprehension. This level of premeditation, this investment of time and money and effort into creating the perfect killing environment, it reveals a mind that was not just evil, but brilliantly, methodically, calculatedly evil. The murder castle stood for 8 years. During that time, dozens of people, possibly hundreds, entered and never left. Their screams were muffled by soundproofing. Their bodies disappeared into acid and flame. Their bones were sold for profit. And Holmes moved through his castle like a spider at the center of a web, always watching, always hunting, always killing. In Chapter 4, we meet the victims, the young women who came to Chicago seeking opportunity and instead found the murder castle. Their stories will break your heart. Subscribe to the unsettling lullaby. The darkness continues. Chapter 4. The World's Fair Girls == Welcome back to the unsettling lullaby. We've walked through the murder castle. Now we meet the souls who were lost inside its walls. Today, we remember the victims, the world's fair girls who never came home. This is Chapter 4. Their stories deserve to be told. The year 1893 brought something Chicago had never seen before. 27 million visitors descending on the city over the course of 6 months. The world's Columbian Exposition was not just a fair. It was a migration, a mass movement of humanity unlike anything America had experienced. And among those millions were thousands of young women traveling alone, seeking employment, seeking independence, seeking a chance at life beyond the small towns that had contained them. They were stenographers and shop girls, farm daughters and city dreamers. They were ambitious, capable, and brave enough to leave everything familiar behind. They answered advertisements in newspapers. Respectable young ladies wanted for employment, good wages, room provided. The ads seemed legitimate. The man who placed them, Dr. H. Holmes, seemed like the perfect employer, educated, successful, kind. Julia Smythe was one of the first. She arrived at Holmes's pharmacy in 1890, well before the World's Fair crowds. She was married to N. Smythe, who worked as a jewelry engraver in one of the ground floor shops. Julia was beautiful, intelligent, and desperately unhappy in her marriage. Holmes noticed. He always noticed vulnerability. Holmes began an affair with Julia. It wasn't love. Holmes was incapable of love, but Julia didn't know that. She believed his promises, his declarations, his assurances that they could build a life together if only End were out of the picture. In late 1890, End Smythe suddenly disappeared. Holmes told neighbors that End had returned to his family in California. Julia seemed to accept this explanation, perhaps because she wanted to believe it. Julia had a daughter, Pearl, about 8 years old. Holmes was strangely affectionate with the child, taking her to the World's Fair, buying her treats, acting like a doting stepfather. For a brief moment, Julia must have believed she had found happiness. She had no idea she and her daughter were living inside a death trap. On Christmas Day, 1891, Julia and Pearl Smythe vanished. Holmes told neighbors they had moved to Iowa to be with family. He showed people a letter supposedly from Julia, though handwriting experts would later question its authenticity. No one from Julia's family ever saw her again. No one ever saw Pearl again. Julia was approximately 27 years old when she disappeared. Pearl was 8. Emmeline Sigrand arrived in 1892, hired as a stenographer. She was 24 years old, engaged to be married, and excited about her future. Her fiancé, Robert Phelps, was planning to join her in Chicago once she had saved enough money for them to marry. She wrote to him regularly, loving letters full of plans and dreams. The letters stopped in December 1892. Robert traveled to Chicago to find her. He went to the address where Emmeline had been working, 63rd and Wallace. Dr. Holmes met with him personally, expressing deep concern. Emmeline had seemed troubled lately, Holmes explained. She had mentioned wanting to start fresh somewhere else. One day she simply didn't come to work. Holmes assumed she had left Chicago to clear her head. He seemed genuinely worried about her. Robert Phelps searched for months. He filed reports with police. He hired private investigators. Emmeline Sigrand had simply disappeared into thin air. Years later, investigators would find jewelry matching descriptions of pieces Emmeline owned, discovered in the basement of Holmes's building amid the acid vats and bone fragments. Minnie Williams came from Texas, a wealthy heiress whose family owned valuable property in Fort Worth. Holmes had been corresponding with Minnie for months, cultivating a long-distance romance. She believed they were engaged to be married. She arrived in Chicago in 1893, bringing with her the deeds to her family's Texas properties worth thousands of dollars. Minnie was lonely, trusting, and desperately wanted to believe that Holmes loved her. She signed over power of attorney to him, giving him legal control of her inheritance. Her sister Nanny, worried about Minnie, traveled from Texas to check on her in July 1893. Nanny arrived at the murder castle on July 4th. Within days, both sisters had disappeared. Holmes told different stories to different people. To some, he said the sisters had traveled to Europe. To others, he claimed they had returned to Texas. He forged letters from Minnie explaining her absence. He began selling off the Texas properties, pocketing the money. The Williams family grew suspicious and hired investigators, but by then Holmes had already moved on to his next victim. Anna Williams, another sister, would spend years searching for Minnie and Nanny. She never stopped believing they were out there somewhere. She died never knowing what had happened to her sisters, never knowing that they had been murdered and their bodies dissolved in acid in a basement in Chicago. The pattern was consistent. Holmes would identify women who were isolated, either geographically or emotionally. He would offer them employment or romance, whatever they needed most. He would gain their trust, their dependence. He would gradually cut them off from family and friends, creating a situation where no one would immediately notice if they vanished. And then, when they were completely vulnerable and isolated, he would kill them. Some were asphyxiated in their sleep. Some were locked in the vault rooms and left to suffocate. Some were pushed down the chutes to the basement and killed on the dissection table. The methods varied, but the result was always the same. Another life erased, another body dissolved, another skeleton sold for profit. The World's Fair brought Holmes an abundance of victims. Young women arrived daily, many with no connections in Chicago, no one who would immediately notice their absence. They came seeking jobs as waitresses, hotel maids, fair workers. Holmes would approach them at train stations, outside employment offices, anywhere vulnerable women gathered. His pitch was perfect. Immediate employment, room included, respectable environment. For a woman arriving in Chicago with limited funds and no place to stay, it seemed like salvation. Most of Holmes's victims will never be identified. We know the names of perhaps a dozen women who certainly died in the murder castle. We can identify another dozen who probably died there based on circumstantial evidence. But Holmes himself claimed to have killed 27 people, and some investigators believe the real number could be over 200. Think about that. 200 individuals, each with their own dreams and fears and families. 200 people who took a chance on life, who were brave enough to seek something better, who trusted the wrong person and paid with their lives. 200 souls whose remains were dissolved in acid or burned to ash or articulated into teaching skeletons and scattered across the country. We'll never know all their names. We'll never hear all their stories. They came to Chicago seeking the future, and instead they found Dr. H. Holmes and his castle of death. Their families waited for letters that never came. They hired investigators who found nothing. They died wondering what had happened to their daughters, their sisters, their fiancées. This is why we remember. This is why we tell their stories. Not to glorify the monster who killed them, but to ensure that these women are not forgotten, that they are not reduced to mere statistics in the catalog of Holmes's crimes. They were real, they mattered, and they deserved so much better than what they found. In Chapter 5, we enter the mind of the killer himself and try to understand the psychology of a man who could build a murder factory and operate it without remorse. The darkness deepens. Subscribe to the unsettling lullaby. I am with you. == Chapter 5. The perfect predator == Welcome back to the unsettling lullaby. We've met the victims. Now we must understand the predator. Today we dive into the psychology of H. Holmes, a man without conscience, without empathy, without remorse. This is Chapter 5. The darkness is absolute. What kind of mind conceives of a murder castle? What kind of person can look another human being in the eye, smile warmly, extend a hand in friendship, all while planning how to kill them and profit from their death? To understand H. Holmes, We must enter territory that is deeply uncomfortable, the psychology of a psychopath. Modern psychologists who have studied the Holmes case believe he exhibited virtually every characteristic of psychopathy: superficial charm, pathological lying, grandiose sense of self-worth, complete lack of remorse or guilt, shallow emotional responses, parasitic lifestyle, poor behavioral controls, promiscuous sexual behavior, early behavioral problems, lack of realistic long-term goals, impulsivity, irresponsibility, failure to accept responsibility for actions, multiple marriages, criminal versatility. Holmes wasn't mentally ill in the traditional sense. He knew right from wrong. He understood that killing was forbidden by law and morality. He simply didn't care. The suffering of others meant nothing to him. Other people were objects, tools to be used, resources to be exploited, obstacles to be removed. His selection of victims was calculated and methodical. He didn't kill randomly or in fits of uncontrolled rage. He chose carefully. The ideal victim was young, female, alone, ambitious, and either geographically or emotionally isolated from family. These women were perfect targets because their disappearance would not trigger immediate alarm. A young woman traveling alone in 1893 might naturally decide to move to another city, might meet someone and get married, might simply lose touch with her family. It was believable. Holmes's predatory process followed a consistent pattern. First came the identification phase, spotting a vulnerable target, usually a young woman who had just arrived in Chicago or who was in some kind of distress. Then came the seduction phase, offering employment, offering romance, offering whatever the victim needed most. Holmes was exceptionally skilled at reading people, at identifying their vulnerabilities and desires, at becoming exactly what they were looking for. The third phase was isolation. Holmes would gradually separate his victim from any support system. If she had friends in Chicago, he would discourage those friendships. If she corresponded with family, he would suggest that constant letter writing made her seem homesick and unprofessional. If she had a fiancé, Holmes would plant seeds of doubt about the relationship. Slowly, systematically, he would make himself the center of her world, the only person she could trust and depend on. The fourth phase was exploitation. Once a victim was isolated and dependent, Holmes would take everything he could. If she had money, he would borrow it and never repay. If she had property, he would convince her to sign it over. If she had life insurance, he would become the beneficiary. He squeezed every possible financial advantage from his victims before killing them. The final phase was murder, and here is where Holmes's complete lack of empathy becomes most evident. He didn't kill quickly or mercifully. Many of his victims died slowly, suffocating in sealed rooms or being gassed in their sleep. Some may have been tortured. Holmes had installed peepholes throughout the murder castle so he could watch his victims die. This wasn't about efficiency. This was about power and control. This was about playing God. After death came disposal and profit. Holmes had turned murder into a business with multiple revenue streams. He would strip the bodies of any valuables, jewelry, clothing, personal effects that could be sold. Then he would dissect the bodies, dissolving flesh in acid and either burning the bones or articulating them into skeletons for sale to medical schools. A complete, well-articulated skeleton could bring in $200, roughly $6,000 in today's money. Holmes was literally selling his victims' bones for profit. But beyond the financial motivation, there was something else driving Holmes. He enjoyed it. He enjoyed the manipulation, the deception, the killing, the disposal. He enjoyed being smarter than everyone around him. He enjoyed the secret knowledge that he was a monster hiding in plain sight. that the respectable Dr. Holmes who ran the pharmacy was actually a serial killer operating a murder factory in the heart of a residential neighborhood. Holmes had at least 3 wives simultaneously: Clara Lovering, Maida Belknap, and later Georgiana Yoke. None of them knew about the others. He kept them in completely separate spheres of his life, lying constantly to maintain the deception. He conducted numerous affairs, often with women he later killed. Sex for Holmes was another form of manipulation and control, not an expression of genuine emotion or connection. His daily routine was remarkable in its normalcy. He would wake up, dress impeccably, eat breakfast. He would open the pharmacy, greet customers with warmth and charm, dispense medications, make small talk about the weather. He would handle business correspondence, pay bills, negotiate with suppliers. And in between these mundane activities, he would check on victims locked in sealed rooms, adjust gas valves to kill someone in their sleep, or spend time in the basement dissecting bodies and dissolving flesh in acid. Then he would wash his hands, smooth his hair, and return upstairs to charm another customer or seduce another victim. The compartmentalization required for this lifestyle is extraordinary. Holmes showed no signs of internal conflict or stress. He slept well. He ate well. He never exhibited guilt or remorse. When questioned about missing employees or tenants, he lied smoothly and convincingly, his demeanor calm and his stories plausible. He was, in many ways, the perfect predator, intelligent, charming, completely without conscience, and utterly confident in his ability to manipulate everyone around him. Compared to other serial killers throughout history, Holmes stands out for several reasons. First, the scale. Potentially 200 victims makes him one of the most prolific killers in American history. Second, the premeditation. Building an entire structure specifically designed for killing shows a level of planning that is almost unprecedented. Third, the profit motive. While some serial killers steal from victims opportunistically, Holmes had turned murder into a systematic business. And fourth, the duration. Holmes operated his murder castle for approximately 8 years without being caught, demonstrating extraordinary ability to evade detection. But here's the question that haunts everyone who studies this case. Why? What was the ultimate motivation? Was it primarily financial? Holmes certainly profited from his crimes, but he was also deeply in debt, suggesting that money slipped through his fingers as fast as he acquired it. Was it sexual? Holmes was highly promiscuous, but many of his victims were killed without any apparent sexual component to the crime. Was it about power and control? This seems most likely. Holmes appeared to derive deep satisfaction from his ability to manipulate, deceive, and ultimately control life and death itself. The most disturbing possibility is that Holmes killed simply because he wanted to, because he enjoyed it, because he had the opportunity and lacked any moral constraints that would prevent him from indulging his darkest impulses. He was a man without a conscience, operating in a time and place where a clever predator could thrive. In Chapter 6, the murder castle begins to crumble. Creditors close in. Investigators start asking questions. Holmes's empire of death is about to collapse. Subscribe to the unsettling lullaby. The reckoning approaches. Chapter 6. The castle burns. Welcome back to the unsettling lullaby. For 8 years, the murder castle stood as a monument to evil, but every empire eventually falls. Today, we witness the beginning of the end for H. Holmes. This is Chapter 6. The walls are closing in. By the summer of 1894, cracks were appearing in Holmes's carefully constructed facade. The murder castle had served him well for nearly 8 years, but now it was becoming a liability. Neighbors had been complaining about strange smells emanating from the building, foul odors that Holmes explained away as sewer problems or issues with the furnace. But the complaints were becoming more frequent, more insistent. The building's reputation was darkening. People in the neighborhood whispered about it. Young women who had rented rooms there and managed to leave alive, those who had simply worked for Holmes briefly and moved on, spoke of feeling uncomfortable, of sensing something wrong even if they couldn't articulate what it was. The murder castle had an atmosphere of dread that was becoming harder to dismiss. But Holmes's most immediate problem wasn't supernatural dread, it was money. Despite years of theft, fraud, and profiting from murder, Holmes was drowning in debt. He had a pathological inability to live within his means. He spent extravagantly, invested in foolish schemes, borrowed constantly, and paid back nothing. Creditors were circling like sharks. In August 1894, a fire broke out on the third floor of the murder castle. It was quickly extinguished before major damage occurred, but the timing was suspicious. Holmes had recently taken out substantial fire insurance on the building. When he filed a claim for fire damage, the insurance company investigated and found evidence of arson. They denied the claim and began looking more closely at Holmes's history. They discovered a pattern: buildings burning, insurance claims filed, suspicions of fraud. Holmes realized the net was tightening. The insurance investigators were asking questions. Creditors were demanding payment. The Williams family in Texas had hired private detectives to find Minnie and Nanny, and those detectives were starting to make connections between the sisters' disappearance and their relationship with Dr. H. Holmes. The castle that had protected him for so long was becoming a prison. In July 1894, Holmes made a decision. He would abandon Chicago. He would leave the murder castle behind and start fresh somewhere else. He had done it before, leaving behind debts and suspicious deaths, creating a new identity, beginning again. It had always worked. Why wouldn't it work now? Holmes had an accomplice named Benjamin Pitezel, a man he had worked with on various schemes over the years. Pitezel was a carpenter, a handyman, a fellow criminal, not as intelligent or sophisticated as Holmes, but useful and willing to participate in fraud. Holmes had a plan for one final major score: a life insurance fraud scheme that would net them $10,000, nearly $300,000 in today's money. The plan seemed simple. Pitezel would take out a life insurance policy for $10,000, nomming his wife Carrie as beneficiary. They would fake Pitezel's death using a cadaver, stage it to look like an accidental explosion, collect the insurance money, and split it. Holmes had successfully pulled off insurance fraud multiple times before. This should have been routine. But Holmes had no intention of splitting the money. He had no intention of faking Pitezel's death. He intended to actually kill Pitezel, collect the full insurance payout, and then, in a twist of stunning cruelty, manipulate Pitezel's wife and children for further profit. Before leaving Chicago, Holmes made one final visit to the murder castle. It was late at night. The building was empty except for him. He walked through the rooms where so many had died. He checked the basement one last time, ensuring that anything too incriminating had been destroyed. He took important documents, cash, jewelry, anything valuable or potentially damning. As he left the building for the last time, Holmes must have felt something. Not remorse, he was incapable of that, but perhaps a sense of accomplishment. He had operated a murder factory for 8 years in plain sight. He had killed dozens, possibly hundreds. He had profited immensely, and he had never been caught. In his mind, he was brilliant. He was untouchable. He was a genius who had outsmarted everyone. The murder castle stood empty after Holmes left, and the neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The strange smells dissipated. The sense of wrongness that had hung over the building began to fade, but the castle itself remained, holding its terrible secrets. Its walls had absorbed screams. Its floors were stained with blood. Its basement contained fragments of bone and the residue of dissolved flesh. Holmes traveled to Fort Worth, Texas, attempting to claim and sell the Williams sisters' property. But the Williams family was suspicious and had lawyers blocking the sales. Holmes was running out of money fast. His debts followed him from Chicago. He needed that insurance payout from the Peitzel scheme. In September 1894, Benjamin Peitzel traveled to Philadelphia to execute the plan. He rented a small office under an assumed name, set up the scene for the accident, and waited. Holmes arrived. What happened next, only Holmes knew for certain. But on September 4, 1894, Benjamin Peitzel's body was discovered in the office. It appeared to be an accidental death from an explosion while experimenting with chemicals. The medical examiner ruled it a suicide. Holmes was nowhere near the scene. He had already left Philadelphia. He had an alibi, but he was very much involved in what happened next. He appeared at the insurance company as a concerned associate of Peitzel's, helping to identify the body and facilitate the claim. The insurance company paid out the $10,000. But Carrie Peitzel, Benjamin's wife, never saw a cent. Holmes told her that Benjamin wasn't really dead, that the insurance fraud had worked and Benjamin was in hiding. He offered to help Carrie to bring her to Benjamin to reunite the family. She trusted him. She had no reason not to. Holmes was Benjamin's friend and business partner. What followed was a journey of manipulation and horror. Holmes convinced Carrie to let him take 3 of her children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, supposedly to bring them to their father. Carrie, desperate and trusting, agreed. Holmes took 15-year-old Alice, 11-year-old Nellie, and 8-year-old Howard on a twisted journey across multiple cities: Detroit, Toronto, Indianapolis, always promising they would see their father soon, always moving, always lying. Meanwhile, Holmes was traveling with his wife Georgiana Yoke, who had no idea about the Peitzel children, no idea about the insurance fraud, no idea she had married a monster. Holmes kept Georgiana and the children in separate hotels in the same cities, managing an impossible juggling act of deception. But Holmes's luck was finally running out. An insurance investigator named Frank Jayer had become suspicious. The claim seemed legitimate on the surface, but something felt wrong. Jayer began investigating. He discovered inconsistencies in Holmes's story. He started tracking Holmes's movements, and he began to suspect that Benjamin Peitzel hadn't committed suicide. He had been murdered. In November 1894, Holmes was arrested in Boston on an unrelated charge, horse theft. It was a minor crime, but it put him in custody long enough for Frank Jayer to dig deeper. As Jayer investigated, the truth began to emerge. Peitzel had been murdered. The children were missing. Holmes's entire web of lies was unraveling. Back in Chicago, police finally obtained permission to enter the murder castle. They had received multiple tips about suspicious activities, about missing persons, about strange occurrences in the building. In October 1895, they went inside. What they found would shock the nation and reveal the full scope of Holmes's crimes. The empire of death was about to be exposed. The charming doctor would be revealed as America's first serial killer, and the murder castle would give up its terrible secrets. In Chapter 7, Detective Frank Jayer begins the most harrowing investigation of his career, searching for the missing Peitzel children and uncovering the full horror of Holmes's crimes. Subscribe to the unsettling lullaby. The truth is coming. Chapter 7. The Philadelphia Conspiracy. Welcome back to the unsettling lullaby. Holmes is in custody. The children are missing, and one determined detective is about to uncover the full truth. This is Chapter 7. The investigation begins. November 1894. H. Holmes sat in a jail cell in Boston, arrested for horse theft, a petty crime that would normally mean a fine or brief imprisonment. But Holmes didn't know that this minor charge would keep him in custody long enough for the walls to completely close in. He didn't know that insurance investigator Frank Jayer was methodically destroying every lie he had constructed. Frank Jayer was a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department, a man known for his thoroughness and persistence. When the Fidelity Mutual Life Insurance Company asked him to investigate the Peitzel death claim, something about the case immediately bothered him. Benjamin Peitzel's death had been ruled suicide, but the scene didn't feel right. The body had been badly burned, making identification difficult. And then there was Dr. H. Holmes, the helpful associate who had appeared to assist with the claim, who seemed just a bit too smooth, too prepared, too cooperative. Jayer began investigating Holmes's background. What he found was alarming. Multiple identities, multiple wives, a trail of debts and suspicious deaths following Holmes wherever he went, business partners who had vanished, properties sold under questionable circumstances. This wasn't a legitimate businessman. This was a confidence man with a long history of fraud. When Holmes was arrested in Boston, Jayer traveled there to question him. Holmes was charming as always. He had explanations for everything. Yes, he had helped with the insurance claim. He was Benjamin's friend and wanted to help the family. Yes, he had traveled with some of Peitzel's children. Carrie had asked him to bring them to their father, who was alive and in hiding. Everything had a reasonable explanation. Holmes smiled warmly and answered every question with apparent candor. But Jayer didn't believe him. Years of detective work had given him an instinct for deception, and everything about Holmes triggered that instinct. The man was too smooth. His stories were too convenient. And most importantly, where were the Peitzel children? Where was Benjamin Peitzel if he was really alive? Jayer exhumed Benjamin Peitzel's body and had it examined by forensic experts. Their conclusion: this was not suicide. This was murder. Peitzel had been killed with chloroform, then the body had been arranged to look like an accidental death from an explosion. The insurance fraud was real, but Peitzel was the victim, not the perpetrator. With this evidence, prosecutors charged Holmes with murder, but there was still the question of the children. Carrie Peitzel was frantic. Holmes had taken Alice, Nellie, and Howard in October, promising to bring them to their father. It was now December. She had received a few letters supposedly from the children, but something about them felt wrong. Where were her children? Holmes, still maintaining his facade of cooperation, provided Jayer with a story. The children were fine. He had left them with a woman in London, or maybe it was New York. The details kept shifting. He could provide an address. Jayer could write to them. But when investigators followed up, the addresses were false. The woman didn't exist. The children were not in London or New York or anywhere Holmes claimed. In June 1895, Frank Jayer began the most important investigation of his career. He had a simple but daunting mission: retrace Holmes's journey with the Peitzel children and find them. He had hotel registries, train ticket records, telegraph receipts, a paper trail that Holmes had been too arrogant to adequately cover. Jair would follow that trail city by city until he found the children. The journey Holmes had taken with the children was bizarre and cruel. He had traveled from Philadelphia to Cincinnati to Indianapolis to Detroit to Toronto and back, zigzagging across the Midwest and into Canada. At each city, he had checked into hotels, sometimes using his real name, sometimes using aliases. And at each city, he had also checked in separately with his wife Georgiana Yoke, keeping her and the children apart, managing an incredible juggling act of deception. Jair started in Cincinnati, showing photographs of Holmes and the children to hotel clerks, asking if anyone remembered them. The trail was months cold. Many clerks didn't remember, but Jair persisted. In Indianapolis, he found a hotel where Holmes had stayed with the children for several days. The clerk remembered them. Specifically, he remembered that Holmes had seemed annoyed by the children, that he had kept them confined to their room. In Detroit, Jair found another hotel, more confirmation that Holmes and the children had been there, but still no sign of where the children were now. The trail led to Toronto, Canada. Jair crossed the border and began checking hotels. At a boarding house on St. Vincent Street, the landlady remembered Holmes. Yes, he had rented rooms there in October. Yes, he had 3 children with him, 2 girls and a boy. But there was something odd, the landlady recalled. Holmes had asked about houses for rent in the area, saying he needed a place for storage. He had seemed particularly interested in houses with cellars. Jair's blood ran cold. Why would someone traveling with children need a house for storage? Why specifically a house with a cellar? Jair began checking rental properties near the boarding house. In mid-July 1895, he found it, a small house on St. Vincent Street that Holmes had rented for a few weeks in October 1894. The current tenants let Jair search the cellar. At first, he found nothing. The cellar appeared empty, but something felt wrong. There was a smell, faint but unmistakable, the smell of decomposition. Jair examined the cellar floor more carefully. In one corner, the dirt appeared disturbed, as if it had been recently dug up and covered. Jair ordered the area excavated. Workers began digging. 3 feet down, they found a trunk. Inside the trunk were the bodies of 2 young girls, Alice and Nellie Peitzel. The girls had been dead for 9 months. Based on the condition of the bodies and the evidence at the scene, investigators determined they had been asphyxiated, likely by gas, similar to Holmes's methods in the murder castle. Holmes had brought them to this house, killed them, buried them in the cellar, and then continued his travels as if nothing had happened. Jair was devastated. He had hoped, against logic, against experience, that the children might still be alive. Now 2 were confirmed dead, but there was still Howard, the 8-year-old boy. The trail showed that Holmes had continued to travel with Howard even after killing the girls. Where was Howard? Jair backtracked to Indianapolis. Holmes had stayed there both before and after Toronto. If he had killed the girls in Toronto, perhaps he had killed Howard in Indianapolis. Jair checked rental properties again. He found a house on East North Street that Holmes had rented for several days. Jair searched the house top to bottom. Nothing in the cellar, nothing in the rooms, nothing in the yard. But the house had a chimney, a large brick chimney with a cleanout door at the base. Jair opened the cleanout door and looked inside. The chimney was partially filled with debris, ashes, bits of trash. Jair had workers carefully remove everything from the chimney. Near the bottom, mixed with ashes and rubble, they found bones, small bones, human bones, a child's bones. Also in the chimney, teeth, fragments of clothing, pieces of a toy. A forensic dentist examined the teeth and compared them to dental records. They matched Howard Peitzel's dental profile. Holmes had killed the 8-year-old boy, likely by strangling or poisoning, then stuffed his body into the chimney and attempted to burn it. 3 children dead, murdered by a man their mother had trusted, killed while Holmes smiled and lied and continued his charades. While he traveled with his wife Georgiana, taking her to restaurants and theaters, he had just murdered 3 children and hidden their bodies. Back in Chicago, police were finally excavating the murder castle. In October 1895, they entered the building with a team of investigators and began a systematic search. What they found confirmed every dark rumor and suspicion. The second floor was a maze of death traps. The basement was a charnel house. They found bones, fragments of human bones scattered throughout the basement. They found surgical instruments, vats of acid still containing dissolved tissue, a furnace containing more bone fragments. They found personal effects that matched descriptions of missing women, jewelry, clothing, photographs, letters. They found evidence of the gas lines running into rooms. They found the peepholes, the trapdoors, the chutes. Every horror that Holmes had constructed was laid bare. Investigators tried to count the victims. They found evidence of at least 9 confirmed murders. They found probable evidence of another dozen. Holmes himself would later claim 27 victims. Some investigators believed the true number could be over 200, based on the sheer volume of bone fragments and personal effects recovered from the building. The nation was horrified. Newspapers across the country ran headlines about the murder castle, about Dr. H. Holmes, about the children buried in cellars and stuffed in chimneys. The world's fair city of dreams had harbored a nightmare. The charming doctor had been a monster, and America would never forget. In Chapter 8, the trial begins. Holmes faces justice for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, and the full scope of his crimes is revealed to the world. Subscribe to the unsettling lullaby. Justice is coming. Chapter 8. The investigation Welcome back to the unsettling lullaby. The bodies have been found. The murder castle has revealed its secrets. Now the full scope of Holmes's crimes is laid bare before the world. This is Chapter 8. The investigation reaches its horrifying conclusion. October 1895. The murder castle at 63rd and Wallace stood open to the world for the first time since its construction. Chicago police, accompanied by forensic experts, newspaper reporters, and curious onlookers, descended upon the building to document what would become one of the most shocking crime scenes in American history. Detective Frank Jayer, fresh from his successful but heartbreaking search for the Pitezel children, joined the Chicago investigation. His experience in Toronto and Indianapolis had prepared him for horror, but even he was unprepared for what the murder castle contained. The investigation began on the ground floor, the pharmacy and shops that had provided Holmes's legitimate cover. These rooms were normal, ordinary. Shelves of medicines, a counter for transactions, account books showing regular business. Nothing here suggested the nightmare that existed above and below. The second floor was where the true nature of the building became apparent. Over 30 rooms, many barely large enough for a bed. The investigators mapped the layout and quickly realized it made no architectural sense. Hallways turned back on themselves. Doors opened to brick walls. Staircases led to ceilings. It was a maze designed to confuse and trap. In room after room, investigators found the gas lines, pipes running through walls with controls located in Holmes's office. They tested the systems and confirmed they worked. A turn of a valve in Holmes's office could flood any of these rooms with asphyxiating gas. The rooms were soundproofed with thick walls and heavy doors. Someone dying in one of these rooms could scream for hours and no one would hear. The vault rooms were particularly chilling. Double-thick walls, iron doors with no inside latches, airtight seals, small peepholes at eye level. Holmes could lock someone inside, watch them suffocate over the course of hours, and there was nothing they could do to escape. Scratch marks were found on the inside of several vault doors, desperate clawing by people trying to escape as their air ran out. The trapdoors were tested. Sections of floor that appeared solid would suddenly drop away when a lever was pulled in Holmes's office. Below the trapdoors, greased chutes led down into darkness. Investigators followed the chutes and found they deposited directly onto the dissection table in the basement. But it was the basement that provided the most damning evidence. The dissection table was still there, a custom-built piece of furniture with leather restraints and drainage channels. Bloodstains, despite Holmes's attempts to clean them, were still visible in the wood grain. Surgical instruments hung on the walls, saws for cutting bone, scalpels for precise incisions, clamps and forceps for dissection. The acid vats were enormous, industrial-sized containers capable of holding hundreds of gallons of corrosive chemicals. Residue testing confirmed they contained acid strong enough to dissolve flesh and soft tissue. At the bottom of the vats, investigators found fragments, small pieces of bone, teeth, jewelry that acid couldn't dissolve. The furnace dominated one wall of the basement. It was custom-built, far larger than necessary for heating the building. Temperature tests showed it could reach over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to reduce human bones to ash and small fragments. Inside the furnace, investigators found partially burned bone fragments, teeth, and metal objects like buttons and jewelry clasps that had survived the flames. In one corner of the basement stood a medieval-looking rack, a stretching device that could extend a body to make the skeleton appear taller. Holmes had used this to increase the value of skeletons he sold to medical schools. Taller skeletons commanded higher prices. Lime pits were discovered, holes in the basement floor filled with quicklime, a substance that rapidly decomposes organic matter. More bone fragments and personal effects were recovered from these pits. Throughout the basement, scattered in corners and hidden in crevices, investigators found personal belongings that told stories of the victims. A woman's hairbrush with strands of hair still caught in the bristles, a locket containing a photograph of a family, letters addressed to young women who had come to Chicago seeking employment, a child's toy, jewelry that family members would later identify as belonging to their missing daughters and sisters. The most heartbreaking discoveries were the items that suggested struggle and terror. Fingernails broken off in desperate attempts to claw through wood or brick, fabric torn from clothing, a woman's shoe with the heel broken off, suggesting she had fought violently. As investigators cataloged evidence, they tried to reconstruct what had happened in this building over the 8 years Holmes operated it. The pattern became clear. Holmes would lure victims to the building with offers of employment or romance. He would house them in the second-floor rooms. He would isolate them from family and friends. Then, when he decided it was time, he would kill them, sometimes by gas, sometimes by asphyxiation in the vaults, sometimes by pushing them down the trapdoors. After death, the bodies would be taken to the basement. Holmes would dissect them on his table, separating flesh from bone. The flesh would go into the acid vats or the lime pits to be dissolved. The bones would either be burned in the furnace or, if they were in good condition, would be articulated into teaching skeletons and sold to medical schools for profit. Investigators contacted medical schools across the country. Several confirmed they had purchased skeletons from Dr. H. Holmes over the years. The skeletons were examined. Some could be identified: dental work, old bone fractures, unique skeletal features, and matched to missing persons reports. These skeletons were returned to families for proper burial. But most victims would never be identified. The acid and fire had done their work too well. Hundreds of people may have died in the murder castle, and their remains had been scattered or destroyed beyond recognition. The investigation expanded beyond the building itself. Detectives interviewed former employees, neighbors, creditors, anyone who had known Holmes. A picture emerged of a man who had fooled everyone. Former employees described him as an excellent boss, generous, friendly, never seeming stressed despite the horror happening around them. Neighbors remembered him as a good citizen who attended community events and made friendly conversation. Women who had worked for Holmes but survived, either because they quit before he decided to kill them, or because something had interrupted his plans, were interviewed. Many described feeling uncomfortable in the building. Several mentioned that Holmes had proposed to them or made romantic advances. A few recalled odd requests: Holmes asking them to take out life insurance policies, Holmes asking them to cut ties with their families, Holmes becoming angry when they maintained outside friendships. The contractors who had built the murder castle were tracked down and interviewed. Their testimonies revealed Holmes's systematic approach to keeping the building's true purpose secret. He had hired and fired over 500 different workers during the 2-year construction period. No one had worked long enough to understand the complete design. Each contractor built one section, then was dismissed before moving to another part of the building. Some contractors remembered odd requests that now made terrible sense. One recalled Holmes insisting that certain rooms be soundproofed, claiming he wanted quiet spaces for meditation. Another remembered being asked to install gas lines into bedrooms, with Holmes explaining it was for an experimental heating system. A plumber recalled the greased chutes and was told they were for laundry. Every abnormal feature had been given a plausible explanation. Financial investigators examined Holmes's business records. They discovered he had been making significant money from multiple sources: the pharmacy, rental income from shops and rooms, insurance fraud, selling the personal effects of victims, and selling skeletons to medical schools. Yet despite this income, Holmes was deeply in debt. He spent extravagantly, invested in failed schemes, and borrowed constantly from anyone who would lend to him. The insurance fraud schemes were particularly elaborate. Investigators found evidence of at least 10 different insurance fraud attempts beyond the Peitzel case. Holmes would take out policies on business partners or employees, kill them, and claim the payouts. In some cases, he used cadavers stolen from medical schools to fake deaths. The sophistication of these frauds revealed a criminal mind of unusual intelligence and creativity. As evidence accumulated, prosecutors built their case. Holmes would be tried for the murder of Benjamin Peitzel, the crime for which they had the strongest evidence. But the murder of the 3 Peitzel children and the dozens or hundreds who had died in the murder castle would be presented as evidence of Holmes's character and methods. The investigation also revealed Holmes's 3 marriages. Clara Lovering, his first wife, was still alive in New Hampshire, still legally married to him. Meada Belknap, his second wife, was living in Wilmette, Illinois, with their daughter. Georgiana Yoke, his third wife, was devastated to learn she had married a monster who had killed children while traveling with her. All 3 women were interviewed. None had suspected what Holmes truly was. He had kept his lives completely compartmentalized, lying constantly to everyone, maintaining separate identities and stories for different audiences. The psychological skill required to sustain this level of deception for years was staggering. By the time the investigation concluded, the evidence was overwhelming. Holmes was a serial killer who had operated in plain sight for nearly a decade. He had built a factory for murder. He had killed systematically for profit, and he had almost gotten away with it. The nation was both horrified and fascinated. Newspapers published daily updates about the investigation. The murder castle became a tourist attraction, with hundreds of people lining up to walk through the building and see the death traps for themselves. True crime, as a genre of public interest, was born from the Holmes case. In Chapter 9, Holmes faces trial for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. The courtroom becomes a stage for the final confrontation between the charming doctor and the justice system he had evaded for so long. Subscribe to the unsettling lullaby. The trial begins. Chapter 9. The trial of the century . Welcome back to the unsettling lullaby. The investigation is complete. The evidence is overwhelming. Now H. Holmes must face justice in a courtroom. This is Chapter 9. The trial of America's first serial killer begins. October 28, 1895. The courtroom in Philadelphia was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled. People stood along the walls. Reporters from newspapers across the country had traveled to cover what was already being called the trial of the century. Outside, crowds gathered, hoping for a glimpse of the defendant who had shocked the nation. H. Holmes entered the courtroom in chains, flanked by guards. The man who walked in bore little resemblance to the charming Dr. Holmes of Inglewood. Months in jail had taken their toll. He was thinner, paler, his clothes no longer impeccably tailored. But his eyes were alert, calculating. Even now, even facing a murder trial, Holmes believed he could talk his way out. The charges were specific: the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. Prosecutors had chosen to try Holmes for this single crime because the evidence was strongest. They had a body, forensic evidence of chloroform poisoning, testimony about the insurance fraud scheme, and a clear motive. The murders of the 3 Pitezel children and the countless victims of the murder castle would be introduced as evidence of Holmes's character and methods, but he was being tried specifically for Benjamin Pitezel's death. The prosecution was led by George S. Graham, District Attorney of Philadelphia, a skilled lawyer with a reputation for thorough preparation and powerful courtroom presence. He had spent months building the case, interviewing witnesses, examining evidence, preparing for every possible defense Holmes might mount. Holmes had hired lawyers to defend him, but he insisted on participating directly in his own defense. This was characteristic. Holmes believed he was smarter than everyone else, including his own attorneys. He would question witnesses, make objections, address the jury directly. It was both arrogant and revealing. Even facing execution, Holmes could not resist the urge to perform, to manipulate, to try to charm his way out of consequences. The trial opened with Prosecutor Graham's statement to the jury. He outlined the case. Benjamin Pitezel had been murdered as part of an insurance fraud scheme. Holmes had killed his accomplice to avoid sharing the money. The method was chloroform poisoning, staged to look like an accidental explosion. Holmes had collected the insurance money, then murdered Pitezel's 3 children to eliminate witnesses and maintain control over Pitezel's widow. Graham's opening statement was powerful, detailed, and damning. He described Holmes not as a man who had killed in passion or desperation, but as a calculating predator who murdered for profit. He promised the jury that the evidence would prove beyond any doubt that Holmes was guilty of premeditated murder. Holmes's defense strategy was simple: deny everything and attack the evidence. He claimed that Benjamin Pitezel had actually committed suicide, exactly as the original death investigation had concluded. The insurance fraud was real, Holmes admitted, but the plan was to fake Pitezel's death, not actually kill him. Pitezel had decided to kill himself instead, perhaps overcome with guilt about the fraud. It was a weak defense, but Holmes delivered it with conviction. When he addressed the jury, he was calm, articulate, even charming at moments. He explained that he was simply a businessman who had made poor choices in associates. He had tried to help Pitezel's widow and children after their father's death. He was not a murderer. He was a victim of circumstance and misunderstanding. The prosecution began presenting evidence. Detective Frank Jayer took the stand and described his investigation. He explained how he had tracked Holmes's movements across multiple cities, how he had found the bodies of Alice and Nellie Pitezel buried in Toronto, how he had discovered Howard's remains in the chimney in Indianapolis. Jayer's testimony was devastating. He presented hotel registries showing Holmes had stayed at each location. He presented testimony from landlords and hotel clerks who had seen Holmes with the children. He presented evidence that Holmes had rented the houses where the children were later found dead. The timeline was clear. The evidence was overwhelming. Holmes cross-examined Jayer, trying to find weaknesses in his testimony, but Jayer was prepared. He had documented everything meticulously. Every question Holmes asked, Jayer had an answer. The detective remained calm, professional, and credible throughout. Forensic experts testified about the examination of Benjamin Pitezel's body. They explained that the pattern of burns and the presence of chloroform in the tissues indicated murder, not suicide or accident. Someone had administered chloroform until Pitezel lost consciousness, then staged the scene to look like an explosion. The person who did this had medical knowledge. They knew exactly how much chloroform to use and how to apply it. Carrie Pitezel, Benjamin's widow, took the stand. Her testimony was heartbreaking. She described how Holmes had convinced her that Benjamin was alive and in hiding, how he had taken her 3 children, promising to bring them to their father, how she had trusted him completely because he was Benjamin's friend, how she had received letters supposedly from Alice, but the handwriting looked wrong, how she had grown increasingly desperate as weeks passed with no word from her children. When Prosecutor Graham asked Mrs. Pitezel if the man sitting in the defendant's chair was the man who had taken her children, she looked directly at Holmes and said yes. Her voice was steady despite her tears. Holmes met her gaze for a moment, then looked away, one of the few times during the trial that his composure cracked. The prosecution introduced evidence from the murder castle investigation. They presented photographs of the building's interior, the gas lines, the vault rooms, the trapdoors, the basement with its dissection table and acid vats. They introduced bone fragments and personal effects recovered from the building. They called witnesses who testified about women who had gone to work for Holmes and never been seen again. Holmes objected vigorously to this evidence. He argued it was prejudicial, that he was being tried for Pitezel's murder, not for crimes in Chicago. But the judge allowed it, ruling that evidence of Holmes's character and previous criminal acts was relevant to establishing motive and pattern of behavior. The testimony about the murder castle shocked the courtroom. Spectators gasped as photographs were shown. Several women in the audience fainted and had to be carried out. The jury members' faces showed horror and disgust as they examined the evidence. Holmes maintained his composure throughout. He occasionally smiled slightly, as if amused by the proceedings. He took notes constantly. He whispered to his attorneys, but he never showed remorse, never showed fear, never showed anything except calm confidence in his ability to manipulate the situation. The defense presented its case, such as it was. They called character witnesses who testified that Holmes had been a good businessman, a friendly neighbor, a respectable citizen. They tried to cast doubt on the forensic evidence, suggesting that Peitzel might have killed himself despite the chloroform findings. They argued that the murder castle evidence was irrelevant to the Peitzel case. But the defense was weak, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The evidence was too strong, too detailed, too overwhelming. Holmes had been caught, and no amount of charm or clever argument could change the facts. When it came time for closing arguments, Prosecutor Graham delivered a powerful summary. He walked the jury through the evidence step by step. He explained Holmes's pattern: identify vulnerable victims, gain their trust, exploit them financially, kill them when they were no longer useful. Benjamin Peitzel fit this pattern perfectly. So did the 3 children. So did the dozens of people who had disappeared in Chicago. Graham concluded by telling the jury that they faced a simple choice. Would they let a calculating murderer talk his way out of justice, or would they hold him accountable for his crimes? The evidence, Graham said, demanded a guilty verdict. Holmes chose to deliver his own closing argument. He stood before the jury, looked them in the eye, and spoke for over an hour. He denied everything. He claimed the evidence was misinterpreted. He insisted he was innocent. He even became emotional at moments, his voice breaking as he talked about how much he had cared for Benjamin Peitzel and his family. It was a performance, and everyone recognized it as such. Holmes was doing what he had always done, trying to manipulate, trying to charm, trying to make people believe his lies. But this time it didn't work. The jury had seen too much evidence. They had heard too many witnesses. They knew what Holmes was. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. On November 2, 1895, they returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Holmes showed no reaction. He simply nodded slightly, as if the verdict confirmed something he had already known. The judge scheduled sentencing for later that week. Under Pennsylvania law, first-degree murder carried only one possible punishment: death by hanging. Holmes would die for his crimes. Justice, finally, would be served. In Chapter 10, we witness the final days of H.H. Holmes and the execution of America's first documented serial killer. Subscribe to the unsettling lullaby. The end is near. Chapter 10. The executioner's rope . Welcome back to the unsettling lullaby. The verdict is in. The sentence is death. Today we witness the final chapter in the life of H.H. Holmes. America's first serial killer faces the executioner's rope. This is Chapter 10. The end has come. November 2, 1895. The guilty verdict echoed through the Philadelphia courtroom. all what seen up. Let that murder out him. The thing that I got him. Oh, yeah, her boarding that hill. It's in all his name, and it will was Dirk saying, ten war on the and marked for I was I'm also to be seen least dirt. He drive more. He misses will go more. Yet ask for the deal. You want to say simple. I have that more. As she wrote, Holmes uses my free fumble. Holmes ordered delivered. The inflict beach them. He had panic way and regular than now. It was young head and the ship. Holmes more room dinner. No days. Holmes terror of her life. The blood is diffusal. He helped him. It cuts rather but this Jim here the Geo is right. You did in our front. He off the line. There's the show almost sounds to like okay. Ex was head face but nice. The door. All men you. He heard that these so to mess with. The FA like on his bill. I know on you. All this that recruit his eyes spade on Bill and this way was full so the demand kiss and he fig the Raymond unenjoyed Gordon's size Hosberg he pressed oak he's finna buff he with a and rock combushing the commencer and that Rosie and Erding's stats six tailings support nine more the report and the unbrushed revive all things can be all new users and Holmes of the house didn't need rap plus the slap as each full to him the more thirdly lost or how feeling words all of its fullness both boy that hair was fat most of the swing of all of the one day wrong and you like to him that by one day hungry and I'm your coaches it would be hotel and it does not dress no that effect that not a lot of those times the player on news is that big thing halfway out joke the hold in the hand the big the next day was that that's Rob Brennan the front box and he opened to call me that message and this word to these phone something asking for their asses once it was wrong that and was effort for a production from Homestead, Lock and Harry. Who was also for the deep, the tranquilly hammer, big red than event, and the function a side chain, ensuring a hospital. The last performance, it come up which people took the things from head, not came up, I opened the sorts everton, I saw it trigger. Bull was low and range for the visitors given bolt and people were drifting, and thanks to the big payment legal rent. 90 thirds fully, the split day pause today. You get more external and shot over. You last stirred the north and black thing this five minutes on the years back. The knockdown age on being so members and the evidence always one of those conditions football. Vegeta out the computer, big life and mags hurlux over the mercy, the nerving and chimid has single for their own. All this is more. You may have the real, not until them, but her interest is her in my house pro, diamond praise. He will have to receive it for the times, the pain all of the defense and code. Catching the fortunes and games so on. And game out of the locations all this to follow. In my hands, please to take. Fins never that, and that comes in the and the door. Hamilton, all people say front couple, mutter now up, they all the mutter, they come with us, Sunday for the night, you know, until there's students that was imaged. Madame Rack is housing me in my impact. They rate their songs and we do at the time, if they see, they'll use them. The bad Silence, not if Vic, the stain when who out in their dreams, they were sitting at homes. They read their love parts. Each time that index, but shows how long, heard out much people, oh, met testing, should either the more labs are good. Is that a lot? They can read the air here, found these with the air. All learning shows around, and lost, met and deal, be much I bang my love, dark rules.